Hey, Walter Sorrells back with another Knife Makers Friday 5. Today, more big news. So today I'll be answering some viewer questions about knife making in a minute, but first, big news, for me anyway. So for years, I've been putting up with a shop that's way too small for me. Well, basically, I outgrew it about 10 years ago, but for a variety of reasons, I just haven't been able to upgrade it until recently. So at the new place, I'll have a shop that's literally like 5 times bigger than what I'm using now. Literally. So this is really exciting to me, obviously, because of the size of my shop has been constraining me, just like in really stupid ways, like just being able to set up all my tools and stuff like that. But I mean, it's caused problems for me in other ways, really just because it's constrained, kind of some of the things that I've been able to do. And now, finally, I'm going to be in a position to do some stuff that I've been planning for quite a while, but I just haven't had the space to implement. Some of this will probably involve an expansion of production in my Tactics Armory line. I wouldn't say that's been on hiatus, but I just haven't been doing as much of these, mid-tech utility tactical knives. That was kind of a project that I started, 7, 8 years ago now. But the coolest things, I would think from you guys' perspective anyway, is that it's going to really expand some of the possibilities that I'll have for teaching, training, doing live streams, whatever, just kind of me communicating stuff to you guys. I have been doing one-on-one teaching at my shop for a long time, and it's just never been well suited for teaching at all, and certainly not more than one-on-one. But, the problem with teaching one-on-one is, first off, you can only do it with one person at a time, but it's also really expensive and, kind of time consuming for me. And, frankly, even 2 people as a crowd in my old shop. So anyway, the hope is that once I get the right gear in the new place, I'll be able to periodically have classes for, like 4 or 5 people at a time. Real hands-on training. Everybody's going to have access to anvils, forges, all that, but at a little bit more reasonable cost than, what I have to charge for one-on-one teaching. But I'll also be expanding my digital training offering, and some of that's going to be because I'm going to have better facilities in the new place. I got space to set up my equipment, being able to get all my recording and editing and uploading done without, setting up all kinds of gear, then having to tear it down. It just takes a lot of gyrations to do video production, and, kind of doing it all in this really small space means that I'm setting things up and taking them down all the time. And uploading done without setting up all kinds of gear each and every time, having a little more space and better light. There are just a lot of elements to it. But bottom line is that my intention this year is to roll out some longer, more tailored courses, do some webinars, stuff like that. I mean, these are things that really I've been planning for a long time, and people are asking for me all the time, and I just haven't had kind of the bandwidth to do it. So keep an eye out for that kind of thing this year. Last quick note, I've been planning to write a basic knife making book for years, and this is the year I'm finally going to make that happen. So again, keep an eye out for details on that. It's going to be a little while, but definitely going to make it happen this year. Finally, if you haven't had a chance, check out the viewer knife video that I did a few weeks back. I put these out every year, and it's just always a cool moment for me seeing the wide range of stuff that you guys are making, from first knives to hard bitten pro type guys who've really accomplished people. So anyway, link in the cards and description. Check that out if you haven't seen it yet. Okay, now let's get to viewer knife questions. Okay, so here's a question from a viewer named David Bishop. He says, I'm just reading it off a teleprompter, by the way. I just watched your video about home forges. I'm a long ways from making a forge, but it seems to me that a chimney flue liner would be the logical vessel. Here's the issue that people, tend to face when they're making forges. Often this is, the first kind of big expense that you have if you want to get into forging. And it looks like, hey, let's find out clever way to avoid having to pay a bunch of money for fancy, specialized kind of materials. Here's the unfortunate thing. The reason that all knife makers use fancy specialized material in forges is because forges get super hot. Just as a for instance, chimney flue material, there are different kinds of chimney flue material and all that, but the lowest temperature ones will basically turn to goo at about 2,000 degrees. Any normal forge used by a knife maker is going to be well above 2,000 degrees. So that kind of material is just not, built for forge purposes. So if you are planning on making a forge, there are places online that you can get refractory materials. They're not crazy expensive. They're more expensive than going down to Home Depot and buying bricks, but there's a reason why everybody uses that stuff. If you don't, the whole thing melts on you. So next question. This is also from the same viewer, David Bishop. You mentioned differential heat treatment and the use of clay to insulate the less hard portion of the blade. I won't read his whole question, but basically he speculates that you could go the other way and, heat the whole thing, dial back the spine with a torch or something, So long answer short, or maybe short answer long in my case. I specialize in Japanese swords, and I talk a lot about clay hardening and how to make hamones. That's kind of a standard part of my arsenal. But what we're talking about is differential hardness in the blade, which means that the edge of the blade is super hard and the spine is softer and more resilient. So you get good edge holding in a blade that's not going to snap in half when you whack it on something. And that's really always the compromise that you're dealing with, especially with swords, longer blades. One way to do that is to temper the blade back. So you harden the whole thing, temper it to kind of a spring temper, and you won't break it, but it doesn't have very good edge holding. So differential hardening is a way of, kind of threading that needle so that you can whack on something, but you're not going to mess up the edge immediately. The clay hardening approach is one approach, but there are many, many other ways of doing it. Just as for instance, if you have something that's kind of marginally hardenable in oil, you can quench that in oil, and 1095 is a perfect example of this. If you heat 1095 to roughly cherry red and quench it in oil, typically it's going to harden on the edge, but not on the spine. This depends on how thick it is and all that. But you end up sort of almost inadvertently with a differential hardening situation. Other ways of doing it, you can heat up the edge with a torch, quench it, and just as if you were using clay, it's only going to harden on the edge. Again, you get differential hardening. One other possibility, and this is actually kind of the traditional way of tempering a lot of old-fashioned edge tools, if you go back hundreds of years, is differential tempering. So in that case, you harden the entire thing, and then you heat the spine, maybe by laying it on a big block of really hot copper or a big chunk of hot iron, like 1,500, 2,000 degree piece of metal. And that heat will propagate from the spine through the blade, and you can watch the colors, and this is what traditional blacksmiths did, is they would watch the colors as it moves from straw to yellow to kind of brown to blue, purple, and then ultimately kind of silver color. And as you track these colors moving across the blade, you can determine when it's time to stop and that the edge has been tempered. This leaves you with a spring tempered spine and a hard edge, which is kind of a different type of solution, but it's the same basic idea of different amounts of hardness all across that blade. So circling back to David's basic question, yeah, a lot of different ways that you can make a blade be hard in one place and softer in another. All right, so now a question from Brad McCubry. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. He sent me a note asking about plasma cutting. Basically, this is a pretty typical situation. As a knife maker, you have a particular design that you want to repeat a bunch of times. One of the biggest, I would say, kind of wastes of time that you can have in the knife making shop is to have a particular design that you repeat a bunch of times, and you have to go to your grinder and just hog off huge amounts of material to make the outline of the knife. That's one way of doing it, but it does take a lot of time, so people are always looking for ways to kind of shortcut that sort of dumb part of knife making. One of them is to use plasma cutting, which is using a little jet of plasma to cut through steel. So here's the drawback of plasma cutting. Plasma, because it heats the metal so much, it decarburizes it, and the chemistry of the material, which normally should be hardenable because of the amount of carbon that's there, and potentially other kinds of carbides and so forth. You screw up all that chemistry in this little margin where the plasma cutter is used. So if you want to use plasma cutting, you basically have to give a little extra space around the exterior of the knife, and you're still going to have to grind off a little bit. Now, I've never used plasma cutting to do this, so I can't tell you any details on that. But, basically, if you ever want to try plasma cutting, my recommendation would be to give yourself, a 1/16 of an inch, maybe around the exterior the first time you try it. Check with other people because, like I said, I am no expert on this. But definitely you want to make it extra large and grind off that part that's been decarburized. That said, probably a better solution is to use a water jet. The basic idea is the same. You have a sort of CNC type, computerized head that moves around and cuts the steel. But in the case of water jet, there's no heat involved. You're just blowing little tiny fragments of abrasive suspended in water at a really, really high pressure through the steel, and so you can probably cut that to a little bit finer tolerances. Again, I'm not really an expert in this. It's not how I do it, but my thinking is that you're better off going with water jet than plasma cutting. That said, if you got a buddy who's got a, metal fab business or something, he's got a plasma cutter, hey, give it a whirl and see how it works for you. Okay, so Brad has another question. He says, can you give me a general rule for material thickness? I'm currently making some neck knives, and I'm using 1/8 inch 1095. When is it necessary to go up to 1/4 inch thickness? Okay, this is a personal preference kind of thing. I personally never use 1/4 inch stock except for forging. If I'm doing stock removal, I personally never use 1/4 inch stock. To me, 1/4 inch thickness should be reserved for camp knives and just really big choppers, things that are really going to get abused. If you make a knife really well with, 5/16, with the 1/8 or, something in that range, 3/16, it's going to be, well capable of doing most normal cutting operations. If you're going to be, whacking it on things, trying to chop down trees, a camp knife, that's a little bit of a different thing. But for most utility knives, hunting knives, neck knives, anything that you would typically carry on you in any place other than kind of out in the field, I wouldn't go with 1/4 inch thickness at all. But like I said, that's just me, the kind of knives that I make. All right, guys, that about wraps it up. This was a little bit longer than my usual Friday Fives, but had a lot of questions to address here. Thanks for sticking with me, and we'll see you soon. Keep making those knives. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.